welcome to the afternoon session. So we have three papers. Let me remind you of the structure. If you have a question, raise your hand. And the rest of it is, as this morning, also reminding you that this is being webcast and is being recorded. Okay, so our first paper is a large team of authors on the social cost of carbon. And the presenters are doing a tag team with Kevin Rennert and Brian Prest.
Thank you very much, Jim, and thank you for inviting this talk. It's wonderful to be here. Go ahead and share my screen here. So today we're going to talk about the social cost of carbon. But first, I'd like to acknowledge all of the co-authors on this paper, because what we're seeing today is really a number of different important work streams that have come together, into this paper, and that we are getting a very, very high level flyover here in this short 15-minute talk. So Brian Prest, Billy Pizer, Richard Newell, David Antoff, Cord Kingdon, Lisa Reynolds, Roger Cook, Adrian Rafter, Johanna Shevchikova, and Frank Erickson. It's been an incredible collaboration to work with all of these wonderful scientists. So given that some of you do not live and breathe the social cost of carbon the way that we do, I thought I needed to start with just a moment on the social cost of carbon. The social cost of carbon, or the SCC, as we'll refer to it, is an estimate in dollars of the economic costs or damages of an incremental ton of carbon dioxide emissions. The social cost of carbon underpins policy analysis across a really wide range of applications in the federal government and elsewhere. Michael Greenstone has dubbed it the most important number that you've never heard of. And he's absolutely right. The influence of this particular number is extreme, and as a result, it's very important for it to be on its firmest scientific footing and its uncertainty characterized to the greatest extent possible. And to that end, the National Academies back in 2017 had a comprehensive set of recommendations for improving the representation of key input variables and characterizing uncertainty, including breaking the estimation process itself into an integrated modular framework. This is something that is open source and transparent. David Antoff at the University of California, Berkeley has implemented this through his open source NIMI platform, as well as recommendations for improving socioeconomics, the representation of the physical climate system, the damage functions, as well as the approach to discounting. And perhaps the most important piece of context here is that the Biden administration right now is currently updating its SCC estimation methodology to incorporate the best available science in line with these National Academies recommendations, with a full updated estimate anticipated for January of 2022. So I think many of the people from the Interagency Working Group are watching now, so thank you very much for all of the work that you're doing to implement the updated science. So the idealized framework that the National Academies put forward for estimating the SCC looks like this, where you have on the left, as the first input, you have a socioeconomic module that has a probabilistic long-run projections of income, population, and emissions associated with those. Those are then fed into an updated climate module, which translates emissions into changes in temperature, sea level rise, ocean acidification, and other aspects of the climate system. The damages module then translates the changes in the climate system into economic damages across a number of sectors like human mortality, agriculture, coastal impacts, and so on and so forth. And then the stream of damages over time is discounted back to net present value dollars using a discounting approach. That is the way you do one calculation to calculate the social cost of carbon. You actually do two calculations by doing this sort of set of calculations, once with an additional pulse of carbon dioxide emissions and once without. And the difference in damages between those two gives you the SCC. Of course, you want to sample around uncertainty. And so you run this thousands and thousands of times, sampling across the uncertain space of many of these different parameters. And the result is a distribution of social cost of carbon that's from which you can derive statistics like the expected value. So updates to all of these different modules are sort of the order of the day for finalizing the update to the social cost of carbon. What we're talking about today is updates based on a few of the pieces of our research, particularly the updates to the socioeconomic module. We're going to use an update to the climate module that really just looks at temperature. The damages module has a lot of work still going on that's rapidly coming to a conclusion, and work from other groups as well. So we'll use a simplified damage module today based on the DICE model. And then we will have our full implementation of updated discounting. So all the results that we'll show today and talk about should be considered illustrative, because these additional pieces need to fall into place in the coming weeks to actually have a fully updated social cost of carbon. So We're going to talk now about the socioeconomic projections, which are clearly important for the calculations themselves, because to understand the damages that climate change might present to society, you have to have some sense of where society is heading in terms of population, emissions, as well as wealth overall. And this is challenging for the SEC in particular because of the very long time horizon for carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, where it stays in the atmosphere for centuries to millennia. And so if you have carbon dioxide in the atmosphere for that long a time, you need to have the socioeconomics to actually account for it, because those damages will persist over time as well. The uncertainty is also quite complex, where future damages depend on improvements in technologies, mitigation policies, changes in the global economy writ large, as well as adaptation itself can be tied to changes in GDP. Finally, the effects of climate change are regional, and so ideally you would have regional detail in your socioeconomics to also support those damage calculations. So for the past few years, we've been working on an approach to actually meet all of these challenges, which we are presenting here as collectively referred to as the RFF Socioeconomic Projections, or RFF-SPs. The RFF-SPs are multi-century probabilistic projections of country-level population and GDP per capita and global emissions. They account for future policies and dependencies between the variables, and they incorporate both statistical and structured expert judgment methods to account for the extended time horizon. Importantly, they fully implement the near-term National Academies recommendations and actually go a long way towards implementing the long-term recommendations of the National Academies as well. The most natural point of comparison, the one that we make within this paper, is as to the shared socioeconomic pathways, or SSPs, which provide non-probabilistic socioeconomic scenarios with associated narratives out to 2100, and were designed to inform the IPCC process and have been used in dozens and dozens of studies, and have provided a really important kind of consistency across those studies. Those projections only got to the year 2100, and so here, for comparison, we use an extension provided by Keystra et al. That takes them out to the year 2300. So with that, let's dive into the three different components of the RFF-SPs. The first is population. So for the population projections, we start by using the fully probabilistic statistical approach that's used by the United Nations for its official population forecasts out to the year 2100. And the leaders of this research, Adrian After and Hanna Shevchikova, were key in developing that methodology overall. Given that those projections only got to the year 2100, however, they need to be extended out to the year 2300 to work for the social cost of carbon. And so the improvements to the model to account for that in terms of quantification of uncertainty for a number of key parameters within that model were developed in accordance and with feedback from a panel of 9 leading demographers. The results, as shown in the panel to the right, where we are consistently throughout this presentation showing kind of the RFF-SP representation for the median in the dark black, with the shaded 90th percentile in dark gray and the shaded 98th percentile in light gray, show that the median world population for the probabilistic projections peaks at around 11 billion in the middle of next century, declines to about 7.5 billion in the year 2300, but has really wide uncertainty, as you might expect for projections going this far out into the future, where the 98% interval ranges from 1.7 to 33.9 billion in the year 2300. In terms of the comparison to the shared socioeconomic pathways, the SSPs, you see that the median is the most comparable to SSP2, but that the trajectory has a fundamentally different shape in terms of the probabilistic one actually peaks and then declines, whereas SSP2 sort of continues to increase slowly over time. Overall, the probabilistic projections have a much narrower range of uncertainty compared to the population projections provided by the SSPs. So we'll turn to economic growth. And for this, providing economic growth at the country level, we started with country level econometric growth projections to the year 2300, generated in accordance with a methodology put forward by Ulrich Mueller and Jim Stock and Mark Watson. But given the time horizon of this going out to the year 2300, we constrained that statistical approach increasingly over time using expert uncertainty that we obtained through a formal expert elicitation under RFF's economic growth survey, which interacted with 10 leading growth experts. As we think about the comparison between those two different approaches, the statistical plus what's provided by the experts, we saw that both of the sources actually viewed extremely high, greater than 4%, and extremely low, roughly 0% long-run growth as highly unlikely, but still possible. We also see that the median projection from the experts showed a much lower long-run growth than provided by the statistical model, with the experts feeling like in 2300s, in the median, long-run growth was going to be under 1%, whereas the statistical model gave you something that was more on the order of 2% sustained over that period. In comparison to the SSPs, we see that the SSPs all fall within roughly the 90th percentile range of the RFFSPs here, but they do not fully span the low end of the range. And that's particularly important when you're thinking about the social cost of carbon, because as you're thinking about climate damages in the future, one world that you very much want to sample is a world in which we have climate damages, and we also are in a world of relatively lower economic growth, because those damages might be felt more acutely than in one in which the world was relatively wealthier. Next, we'll turn to the projections of emissions. For the projections of emissions, global emissions here, we turned exclusively to a panel of experts under RFF's Future Emissions Survey, where 10 leading experts in socioeconomic projections quantified their uncertainty for 4 different categories of future emissions. Importantly, they included uncertainty in their future projections for this case, on a case that we refer to as evolving policies, which incorporates their expectations on future policy and the uncertainty around that. This is important not only because it was the National Academy's recommendation, but because the way the US does its federal regulatory impact analyses, the idea is that you are assessing the effects of a given policy with a full background of additional policies. So you're basically looking at what the world is going to look like, with the exception of the policy in question that you're analyzing. So the fact that our experts provided that uncertainty, including policy, is a very important feature of this data set. The carbon dioxide distributions were conditioned also on future economic growth. So we got a sense of what the experts thought emissions distribution might look like for a very wealthy world, a very poor world, and everything in between. The results I'm showing you here in this figure are actually thereby drawn from the economic growth projections that we have that then sample from the appropriate emissions distributions from the experts. And you see that the median projections indicate a roughly 60% reduction of carbon dioxide by 2100, with a wide range of uncertainty that also includes net zero emissions by 2100, but includes the chance for substantial increases in emissions as well. In comparison to the SSPs, you see the SSPs 1 and 3 are relative outliers through 2100 compared to the RFFSPs. They tend to kind of trace out roughly the 98th percentile range from the RFFSPs, where the SSP2 actually tracks relatively well with the median from the RFFSPs over time in kind of the aggregate. SSP5 is well outside the range of what we receive from the experts used in concert with our economic growth projections. And importantly, the requirements that the SSPs, the emissions projections from the SSPs are forced to zero, in the extension out beyond 2100 to receive yield zero at roughly 2250, is generally inconsistent with what we actually observed from our experts in their emissions quantification. We can take all of this and these emissions and put them through an updated climate model. And for this, we took the emissions from the RFFSPs, sampled them, and used them as an input to the latest version of the FAIR model, which was a climate model that was endorsed in the National Academy's report. The results from using this are that the median temperature pathway for the RFFSPs shows a roughly 3 degrees Celsius increase from pre-industrial level by 2100, and continued increases out beyond that out to 2300. There's a roughly 10% chance when we look at this of staying below 2 degrees Celsius by 2100, and negative emissions that were provided in the experts' elicitation allow for pathways that peak and then decline overall. In comparison to the SSPs, the SSP temperature pathways roughly span the RFFSP range through 2150, but then they narrow as the SSP emission pathways, again, are forced to zero by construction. An important piece of this, additionally, is that the shaded area that we were providing for the RFFSPs incorporates the uncertainty that comes from the climate model itself as we're sampling over those uncertain climate parameters. That uncertainty is not represented for the median projections that we have for the SSPs. With that, I'm going to turn to my colleague, Brian Press, to conclude the presentation.
So Brian, you've got about a minute and a half.
Okay, I'll try to make this quick. Everything that Kevin just described allows us to generate a distribution, a Monte Carlo distribution of a path of marginal damages from an incremental ton of CO2 into the future, but those damages need to be discounted to the present. And so this is where discounting comes in. Currently, the existing IWG government approach to the discount rate is a constant discount rate, which is tantamount to using a linear utility function and effectively non-stochastic discounting. Looks like we lost the slides.
Sorry.
Kevin, are you going to throw them back up, or should I?
I am.
Just keep going, Brian.
Okay, so the National Academies recommended updating this approach to account for the fact that the discount rate should vary with economic growth. So there's two components in the National Academies recommendations. One is that the discount rate should be consistent with near-term policy rates, such as 3% as previously used by the IWG, while also reflecting the link of the discount rate to growth uncertainty into the future. And so it involves a relationship like this: the discount rate is equal to rho plus eta times G. And so in another companion paper, Newell Pizer Press 2021, we find a way to empirically calibrate what those parameter values are rather than picking them kind of out of the air. And that produces a term structure of interest rates that into the future that's consistent with the literature on interest rate behavior, in particular this Bauer and Rudenbush 2021 paper. That produces these rho and eta values that we could use to discount the SEC marginal damages down to the present, and that is going to appear in our next slide, Kevin. So these are, again, illustrative results, as Kevin suggested, because we have completed 3 of the 4 major categories of updates recommended by the National Academies report. We are going to be using, for the 4th category that we have not yet completed our updates, we're going to be using a simplified damage function based on the well-known Nordhaus dice model, but everything else is going to reflect all of the changes we've made, including the probabilistic RFF SPs, the stochastic discount rate, and the FAIR model. And so the result is for 3% equivalent and 2% equivalent discount rates, but again, stochastic discount rates. We have distributions of the SEC, and the mean values here, again, illustrative, are $56 a ton at a 3% equivalent rate, and $171 a ton at a 2% equivalent rate. So you might be wondering, how does that compare to past estimates of such as the existing interim estimates by the Biden administration? And so again, because we're using the dice damage function, we should be comparing it not to the overall number, which is say $51 at 3%. We should be comparing it to the dice only number from the interim estimates, and so that's $46 at 3%. Or $112 at 2%. And so if you compare those two numbers to our illustrative numbers, we're seeing that implementing all of our updates, stochastic discounting, the RFF SPs, and the fair climate model, with holding the dice damage function constant, you're seeing about a 20 to 50% increase in the SEC. So this is suggestive that we're seeing an increase in the direction of the SEC as the result of the combination of these updates. Another comparison is to compare it to what the SECs would look like if you just used these shared socioeconomic pathways that Kevin was describing. And that's what you see on the right here is distributions among each SSP where the distribution owes to climate uncertainty. And what you can see is by comparing across the distributions that socioeconomics matter. Basically, if you, the kind of higher, more outlier SSP5 produces a much larger SSP compared to the other, SCC compared to the other SSPs. So these figures are really just making the point that socioeconomics matter. And if you were to try to do some type of averaging or weighted averaging across the SSPs, then the subjective probability weight you put on SSP5, it could matter quite a bit to your final number.
So Brian, you need to wrap up.
Yes, so next slide is the conclusion. So I will wrap up very quickly, but the short version is that socioeconomic uncertainty matters, and our approach allows formally probabilistic projections of those socioeconomics that speaks directly to the National Academies recommendations. Further, it's important to pair this with stochastic discounting links to economic growth. And doing all of these speaks directly to 3 of the 4 National Academies recommendations, and we are currently undergoing the process of implementing the final category of updates, which is the damage function. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Brian. First discussant is Michael Greenstone, University of Chicago.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to be here. Let me see if I can share my screen. And presenter mode. Okay, can you guys see my slides? I'm a little worried you can't.
Yeah.
No, not yet. Okay, so then we're gonna do it the other way. Okay, how's that? Okay, great. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this important paper. And I kind of set for myself the task of, since I knew they would only have 15 minutes to talk about what they actually did, to try and put it in some larger context and illustrate what I think is so important about this paper. So there's just first a little advertising about climate change, since I know this group is not filled only with climate nerds. Here's just the pathways potential pathways that we're on with respect to temperature. This one is probably not plausible, but very large increases in temperature over the course of the century. I don't think a 2 degree, the planet is not going to stick to 2 degrees. I think it's very unlikely. But if it were, it is daunting, the reduction in emissions that would be required. I just think this is like a basic education slide for climate change. Here's what's been true, and you would really have to require some kind of, unprecedented large reduction. So turning to what Kevin and Brian and their team did, which is to really think hard about the social cost of carbon, which is the monetized damages from the release of an additional ton of CO2. As background, the Obama administration set the first US government social cost of carbon at, after some updates, at $52. The Trump administration, I would argue without scientific justification, lowered it to $1 to $8. And now the Biden administration has returned it effectively to the Obama number and is actively working to update it. The social cost of carbon has been used in 80 regulations with more than $1 trillion of benefits, gross benefits, by 2017. It's used by states. The New York State grid operator wants to use it in wholesale electricity markets. Other countries are using it. It's very influential on what happens to carbon policy. I think, and I should say in full disclosure, Billy and Richard and I were involved, and I co-led with Cass Sunstein a process to set the social cost of carbon initially in 2009 and 2010. But what I left that process thinking was, and this is where their work comes into play, is, my goodness, Bill Nordhaus was incredibly influential in shaping our thinking and giving us a framework to think about the social cost of carbon and climate damages. And that's through his DICE model, which is generically referred to an integrated assessment model. But when I left government, I thought to myself, whoa, the IAMs, the integrated assessment models, have lots of problems. It's super reliant on expert judgment. That is a very, very limited set of people who actually understand what goes on in those models. They were done in a period when computers were kind of terrible. Like, computers were worse than this thing I'm holding up right now, my phone. And so what those guys did who set up those IMs was totally reasonable, which is they kind of had to make up some assumptions, like, is the relationship between temperature and GDP quadratic, or is it cubic, or quartic? They came to some conclusions about that. They had kind of fallen behind what was really a growing and robust climate damages literature. There was a very incomplete accounting for uncertainty, and that's what this paper is about, and I'm going to come to that in a minute. And also was produced highly aggregated estimates. What would happen, to the average person on the planet, but no one lives at the average, and they want to know what's happening where they live. And so I was constantly reminded of the Winston Churchill comment, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others that have been tried, which is the IMs were great, but they were great only in the sense that they were better than everything else we could think of. And what I want to argue is that we're at the dawn of a new era of understanding climate damages. And this work is an important part of that. And I'll now try and outline this. This is a slightly different, this comes from a paper that Tamara Carlton and I wrote. But just like Kevin outlined, you should think of there being 4 pieces of that go into the social cost of carbon or climate damages: the socioeconomic and emissions pathways, the climate model, damages, discounting, and then overlaying all of that as uncertainty, and then all of that can produce the social cost of carbon. And I have to call out all of my terrific colleagues. Much of what I'm saying here is a reflection of the work that this group of people has done in also trying to participate in bringing the social cost of carbon and climate damages into kind of the modern era. So let me just talk for a minute about putting in context what they did. So you should think of what they're doing is they're really tackling the socioeconomic and emissions pathways, which were very crude and certainly did not reflect any sense of uncertainty. And so they kind of have, I think, pulled out the Jenga piece of what was used before and replaced it with probabilistic projections, as Kevin said, of population, economic growth, and emissions. You could think of their value add here as there were some statistical models for each of those. Some that had to be jiggered with a little bit to get them to go to 2300, not to 2100, but there were statistical models for each of those. But then they convened a panel of experts to provide additional information to make these projections richer. And so I put this in, how you feel about expert elicitation. I think it's like different people have different views on it. It's not my cup of tea, but that's what they're feeding into it. And so, when you think about population growth estimates, you got the statistical stuff plus these 9 people. When you think about the economic growth stuff, you've got Jim's work with Muller and Watson, plus you got these 10 people with their personal views. Some of them are even my friends. And then with the emissions, you kind of got the same thing. None of the demographers are my friends, but some of the emissions people are, and some of the economic growth people are. And so that's what they kind of put together into a brew, and outcomes. Really a very important finding that socioeconomic uncertainty was not being captured and is an important part of the social cost of carbon. Then the next step, which is you have to choose a climate model. We could spend, and I'm not the right person, but you could spend a lot of time talking about what the right climate model is. I think what they did is totally mainstream and sensible, using the FAIR model. And I think my time is not well spent on that. I'll just note it. The next step, which is where, full disclosure, a lot of my time and a lot of Climate Impact Lab's time has gone to, is to try and rebuild or build empirically founded damage functions. And, just to give you a flavor of why that's so important, the 3 IAMs, the FUN model, the DICE model, and the PAGE model were all really kind of developed in the 1990s. So to the degree that there were computers, I was in graduate school then, so there were, and that there was data, there wasn't a ton of it. And basically those 3 models missed out on everything that happened since 2010. And this is one way of illustrating there's this very booming literature that they're not able to take advantage of. And so you can move out of a world of relying on data maybe from some northern rich European countries to data that covers the world and try and use that to make progress. And so that's, I think, a very rich area, is trying to get these damage functions right. I probably don't have time to explain this slide, but I'll just note there are 2 really important features of it, or a couple of very important features that have come out of this work. The first is there's incredible heterogeneity around the planet. What happens in Oslo when cold temperatures arrive is very different than what happens in Accra, and what happens when hot temperatures arrive in Accra is very different than what happens in Oslo, as an example. And that's because there's these very nonlinear relationships between temperature, and there's lots of, and in this case, mortality, and also adaptation. And so what we have tried to put a lot of effort into is developing localized estimates. A second thing that's really important is to realize and recognize the uncertainty that exists in the damage functions. And there's really two sources. So these guys were focusing on socioeconomic uncertainty. There's two other sources that we focus a lot on, and I think they're important to feed in to the overall social cost of carbon. The first is, even if I told you, or if I told my climate science friends what was going to happen to emissions, they're very uncertain on what's going to happen to temperature. So here's one emissions pathway, and this is kind of the range that they think will be for temperature. Here's another emissions pathway, and here's the range for temperature. You can see they're very wide. So there's a lot of uncertainty around that. And then another source of uncertainty is the damages. Well, we don't know with certainty what's going to happen to mortality rates or agricultural yields or whatever, given a temperature change. And so this is drawn from one of our papers. It's global damages in 2100 just from mortality. And I just want you to, drink in these very wide ranges. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute, of the likely global damages from mortality. And again, in this crowd, I don't think we have to have the kind of conversation you normally have where uncertainty means we shouldn't do anything. It's actually just the opposite. The uncertainty pumps up how much we should do. That's true in mortality, in our work, coastal, labor, agriculture, energy. It seems to be a feature that this climate and econometric uncertainty or damage uncertainty is present everywhere. It's also true, as I noted, that uncertainty and the impacts are highly unequal around the planet. And having data allows us to really dig into that. Previously, the IAM models were only able to divide the world into at most 16 regions, which was effectively treating Miami and Minnesota the same. And okay, so that's what I want to say about the damage functions. But like Kevin and Brian's work, a really important feature of that is uncovering the degree of uncertainty that exists.
And Michael, you need to be wrapping up.
I will. So with respect to discounting, I think it's pretty straightforward what they did. And what that illustrates is two things, is that growth uncertainty is important, and what is referred to as a climate beta is also very important. All of that leads to, and I'm going to skip this, to the estimates of the social cost of carbon. And so here, I just want to, since I think this is coming out of the same place that they are, underscore the uncertainty. Here are estimates of the uncertainty, estimates of the mortality only social cost of carbon under two different emission scenarios, 8.5 and 4.5, and the box plots are the 25th and 75th interquartile range. And I just want you to see, like, there are bad states of the world where you could go all the way up to $250, even though the mean is probably like $40. And that uncertainty had not previously been adequately quantified and certainly not included in the calculations. So let me just try to conclude since I'm at time. I think a new era of understanding climate damages has arrived. Like, thankfully, we don't have to, we have computers and we have data. A hallmark of that is that these damages can be empirically founded. A second point I want to make, which is really, I think, the center of their paper, is that accounting for uncertainty is a critical part of improving the social cost of carbon. They demonstrate that in particular with respect to socioeconomic uncertainty and its correlation with damages. I think there are both strengths and weaknesses of expert elicitation. In some sense, how could you not want to use what Daron Acemoglu or Bob Gordon thinks about economic growth? On the other hand, I kind of have some resistance to it because it's a little bit going back to the old way of doing things, of relying on expert judgment as opposed to using data. But I think different people are going to fall in different places there. But the most important thing to take away, I think, is that it's critical to account for uncertainty and damages in climate. So thank you very much.
Okay, thanks a lot, Michael. Next discussant is Mar Reguant.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I really appreciate it. So Michael has a whole team of many people working on the social cost of carbon. I'm far from an expert the way that the presenters or Michael is, but I hope that my comments are useful to the paper. I really enjoyed reading this paper, and as Michael already suggested, and the presenters themselves, this is an extremely important topic, even if only because it matters a lot for policy. So even only for that reason, everyone should care about it. And on top of that, I believe many of us care genuinely about it, because it's telling us the impact of climate change in some kind of a summarized way, which is kind of tricky because it's so uncertain what's going to happen, but at least it's kind of an attempt to provide some guidance. So this is an important contribution. The paper in itself is kind of a summary, so I think I missed some of the details. You will see it in my in my discussion, but it is part of a much broader agenda that this team is putting together to basically come up with a framework that can help summarize what the social cost of carbon should be, and importantly, very closely talking to policymakers. So this study and the larger agenda in which it falls could be crucially important for climate policy in the country. And that, I think, again, I think everyone should care about that, as it can really impact what passes cost-benefit analysis, for example. So the paper focuses on incorporating this uncertainty that I think has already been well explained here. I mentioned climate emissions and growth trends, but there's also population. This is kind of one side of it, and the other one is to take into account the fact that the marginal utility of income is declining via the stochastic discount. So the bottom line is that the stochastic discounting puts more emphasis on the social cost of carbon during bad growth outcomes, which is very intuitive, at least to me. I kind of missed in the paper why we don't think about this also in the cross section, as a similar argument kind of goes through immediately as soon as you think about the integral of heterogeneity within a period versus the integral of heterogeneity over time. The minute you put that utility function, you get a similar correction. So it would be nice in future work to see if similar corrections can be made to the within period social cost of carbon. So the finding is that good outcomes tend to have much higher social cost of carbon in their estimates. So when we take into account this fact that the marginal utility is decreasing with income, actually it does lead to a downward correction of the social cost of carbon. And in some sense, it's driven by this finding, which took me a bit of time to understand, that the uncorrected social cost of carbon is actually increasing. So the higher the income a country has, the higher the damages, and therefore the social cost of carbon. So this is a bit of a kind of baked in a little bit into the model. So I'll push back a bit against this, because it took me a while to figure out this, and it was kind of counterintuitive to me. So I want to make some thoughts. I want to give some thoughts on why this was surprising to me. I was kind of initially surprised because I tend to think of the social cost of carbon as being higher when people are poor. And this is more informed by the cross-section than the temporal kind of growth macro perspective. So it's more coming from my microeconomic background. But I do tend to think of the low income and either countries or individuals as being much more exposed to climate change, and therefore as facing higher social cost of carbon at the margin. I know that getting a number for the social cost of carbon doesn't allow to get into such detail, but I think it would be great to think about how to take this into consideration, maybe through some sensitivity on the climate data. So here I say that growth is uncorrelated with climate, and this I think I misunderstood, because as you explained, you asked your experts how growth and climate emissions would be related. I missed it a little bit in the paper, so I guess maybe you could emphasize a bit more what's the role of that kind of feedback between what the experts thought was the correlation between emissions and growth, because to me that's another big source of thinking that the social cost of carbon could be maybe not as positively related with growth. So finally, I wanted to make a bit of a point on beliefs themselves from the experts. So I was a bit surprised at how symmetrically centered. They seem to be around, let's say, 2%. And it's kind of a symmetric distribution on both ends. I am squinting the distribution, so I'm not really sure, but let's say it's a normal distribution, not normal, obviously, because it doesn't have infinite support, but you know what I mean. It's a relatively symmetric distribution, but however, growth compounds. So the fact that growth compounds, it's kind of behind this finding that the social cost of carbon exponentially grows over time, because as you grow at 4%, your kind of income grows exponentially, and therefore the losses on that exponential growth on income can actually be disproportionately high. So I was kind of thinking whether experts could have some bias, these 10 experts that Michael mentioned. In more micro studies of gasoline, we think of the MPG illusion, the fact that we measure miles per gallon instead of gallons per mile can kind of get you thinking a bit differently on what the chances are on either side. So I was wondering whether this symmetric distribution, again, could maybe put a bit too much weight on that exponential growth that we're seeing that's driving those very high social cost of carbons, counterintuitively to me, when we are in very good outcomes. So these are maybe some thoughts, and maybe, I don't know, it's kind of something that came to mind. On the expert elucidations, I think it's important, and it might be the best you can do given the framework, but I think we have to keep in mind that these are completely out of equilibrium trajectories for climate. So I feel it's so hard to come up with a forecast of what's going to happen when something hasn't happened yet. I almost put the picture of the particle concentrations in the atmosphere of CO2, and they're just exponentially growing at ranges that we have never seen in human time. So I think it's really very difficult to forecast. Again, I'm not suggesting anything for improvement, but I do think uncertainty is probably even higher. So the uncertainty that you document already matters for these estimates, but the real uncertainty is really, truly way higher. And events like COVID, for example, but in a more persistent nature, wouldn't be reflected in this type of uncertainty. So again, I think this is a difficult question. So I'm not sure I have bulletproof suggestions here, but maybe one was expanding on the correlations, which I understand now you have built in a little bit into these expert elucidations. The other one would be to just do some elucidation on climate betas. These wouldn't fix the above problem that I mentioned, that these are extremely things that are extremely hard to forecast, even with data, Michael, because we have never seen data when particles concentrations are 500, 600, 700, and 1,000. So ppm, it's just at a range we have never seen. But I think the combination of the two, again, it's maybe the best path forward, but understanding that we are really kind of in the blind a little bit, and that makes things really hard. So that's kind of, again, not a very constructive thought, but that's something that comes to mind when reading the paper. So on that note, I do think I wanted to, I know this is a controversial slide because here we have a lot of champions of the social cost of carbon, but I wanted to try to have a bit of a discussion on bridging what I would call the target approach versus the social cost of carbon approach. So as some of you may know, I was working with Christian Gollier on a report for President Macron to see what the perspective for the French government should be in the years forward. It was a very high level policy, but the premise of the policy was that we would stick to the political goals of the European Union, which is to decrease emissions quite substantially in line with the emissions decreases that Michael was showing us in that picture. Importantly, those emissions decreases are only for Europe, so they don't get us anywhere near close that emissions decreases that Michael was showing. But the explicit statement, at least in Europe as of now, is that we should kind of have a clear trajectory of emissions going down. In contrast, in the US, the position is more to quantify the social cost of carbon and kind of work on that social cost of carbon. I don't see this as kind of a battlefield where one of the two approaches should win. And maybe it's a little bit like the Weizmann prices versus quantities type of argument. But I do think there's uncertainty on both ends. And in many ways, it's really not clear which uncertainty is larger. So when I think about the social cost of carbon and what we need to quantify it, we have all of these completely out of equilibrium perspectives. on what's going to happen when the planet heats in ways that we have never again observed before. It's true that we have observed different regions at different temperatures, but that's quite different than heating up the entire planet. So it's not quite observed in the data. So that's quite uncertain. Population growth is extremely uncertain as well when you put all of those uncertainties together. And certainly policy uncertainty about the emissions pathways is extremely high. So all of these things can be elicited, but I do think they are extremely uncertain. When it comes to the target approach, it also comes with huge uncertainties. But given the progress we have seen on the technology front, I think it is slightly more clear what price of CO2 it should take to, for example, get the electricity sector, which is my field of expertise, out of fossil fuels. Out of fossil fuels, I mean residualizing fossil fuels. There will always be some residual power plant, but we kind of have a good idea of what that price of CO2. So when I think about the electricity sector in particular, there is way more certainty when it comes to targets than when it comes to the damages. That said, in other sectors, that could look completely different. So I think we kind of need to reach the two approaches much more explicitly. Again, I do not see them as competing, and I'm not trying to say with this that one is better than the other, but I do think that the perspective of working under that premise for the Macron report with Christian Gollier kind of gave me a bit of a different perspective on that, which given my US training was much more focused on the social cost of carbon. So I think it's necessary to bridge the two approaches because they can provide some validity to the two. And in particular, in your paper, and I understand your social cost of carbon is illustrative at the moment, a $56 per ton of CO2 cost of carbon struck me as extremely low, especially given the beliefs that your experts have about what emissions will do in the future. So I see a $56 ton per carbon price of SCC as doing really not much to displace the fossil fuel industry. It makes at the margin consuming fossil fuels more expensive, but it's really, I would say, not internally consistent with the elicited paths of emissions from the experts, at least with current technology. It's true that new technologies might be developed thanks to the social cost of carbon, but it's quite unclear to me that that 56 tons per carbon will actually do it. So I think it would be great to combine the two approaches, and given that you recommend this $56 per ton of carbon CO2, what would be the projections for emissions under that social cost of carbon? Maybe an upper bound of that projection would be under current technology. You could also bound it with some assumptions on how much technology will improve. But I do think it will be quite important to provide some more internally consistent social cost of carbon. I say this because it's particularly important as a measure. And as you said, it will inform many, many environmental policies in the United States. So if you come up with a $56 ton of carbon, actually it should impact the emissions path if it does trigger these environmental, oops, this is me talking too much on the same slide. Let's see if you can see it now. Yes. So as I was saying, if you recommend this $56 per ton of CO2, it's really very unclear that we can kind of achieve this kind of thing that the experts are predicting, especially because many countries will not do much to reduce their emissions. And as of now, except for COVID, the only thing we are seeing is that emissions keep going up in the world. So this is kind of a bit of a concern to me, because if emissions end up being like this, because this is not really a strong enough policy consistent with these pathways, it will mean that the social cost of carbon is not truly $56. It should be something much larger. I know it's kind of hard to do that kind of a fixed point, given the data that we are working with, but I think for future work, it would be interesting to work as part of a bigger fixed point, where you also consider climate policy uncertainty, particularly from developing countries that might not take that social cost of carbon as set in stone. To be fair, the US and Europe might not take it as set in stone either. So I'm not very hopeful. this is kind of what I mentioned here, a critical feedback loop. So climate policy is an important source of uncertainty in this whole picture. And in particular, it feeds back obviously on emissions and it feeds back on GDP. And I think it's an important source of uncertainty that it does get directly informed by the number that you're coming up with. So in your kind of framework, you come up with a social cost of carbon as a result from your process, but I think it's also part of the process. Again, I'm not sure how that could be incorporated, but at the very least, I would provide some sanity checks on what the social cost of carbon would be doing. For example, if OECD countries were to stick to it and no one else. So this is my comment, I think. So thank you for letting me read the paper, and I appreciate the authors working on these extremely critical issues that we are all facing.
Thanks, Mar, for the terrific discussion. I realize that I probably should have made a prefatory editorial remark before this paper. So let me just make an editorial remark at this point. This is not the usual Brookings paper where we sort of dig into a topic like the 3 excellent papers we had this morning. This is really, I think, more of a report on an incredibly important problem that merges the 2 leading teams doing research on that. The Climate Impact Lab Berkeley team. I guess merge isn't necessarily the right thing if one's discussing one's authors, but one is the discussants under Michael's, with Michael's group, and then the authors with RFF and Berkeley, and Berkeley seems to have a foot in each one of these teams. This is a really important project. A lot has been happening in the last 4 years, a lot of really first-rate science, and so this is a report on that science and the role it plays. The second editorial comment is that, of course, the undertaking is totally ridiculous, and no one in their right mind would try to do it, projecting out population and GDP for 300 years and then, rolling that on top of all of this other junk. And the fact that there's two such distinguished teams really putting a huge amount of resources into it underscores how important this is in the climate policy space. And it's one of the key contributions that economists have made to it. That said, it's important to interpret it the right way. As Mar correctly points out, if you just interpret this as the price of a carbon tax, and then we say we're done, been there, done that, carbon tax, that's not going to achieve this objective. Things are much more complicated than that. There's more externalities than just the greenhouse gas externality, but this is a really important start. So I will not go with my other editorial comments, and instead we have a hand up by Michael Kiley. I could give a lot more editorial comments, but I won't with that. We have a comment from Michael Kiley. I think you can unmute now, if I did the buttons right.
I thought I had hit the button, but apparently I hadn't. Can you hear me now?
Yep, that's good.
Okay, great. Yeah, and I mean, this is a great paper and a really important topic. Thank you so much. And this is very much not my area of expertise, and I really am beginning to learn a lot and appreciate it. A couple comments, one of which may be very predictable from someone who's worked for a long time in the monetary policy space, and who has had many colleagues, thinking about the long run real interest rate, and myself, I've thought about that. I think the authors have responded to the data and the emerging literature suggesting that real interest rates may be, much lower than previously appreciated, for a long time. But I think some may have the view, or at least it's not implausible that they may have underreacted. I think it's plausible to entertain, and I think a fair number of, maybe monetary economists not completely familiar with all the complexities of the social cost of carbon, would make an argument that the baseline real interest rate, likely to prevail, is below 2%, and maybe even appreciably below 2%. And estimates of the SEC are obviously going to be extremely sensitive to the baseline real interest rate as that real rate approaches zero. So at least in, that's another dimension of uncertainty, or are plausible other views that might substantially increase the estimates of the social cost of carbon. One other comment relates to my understanding of the climate beta, which is incredibly imperfect and even potentially wrong. I want to preface my remarks that way. But in the paper, and my sense is in much related work, the climate beta is often positive for the reasons the discussant outlined. Reflecting assumptions on the shape of the damage function, that it's a percent of GDP, and also a focus on what are uncertainty about the future path of GDP, but uncertainty about relatively stable future paths of GDP. That is, paths that involve, stable economic growth over the long run. I think actually the macroeconomy and the risks and the concentration of economic losses are not, whether growth is 2.5% or 1.5%, this year or next, although that's really important when compounded over many years, but rather are whether or not there are extremely poor outcomes in which many people lose jobs and others. And I think there is, some evidence that bad climate scenarios are also ones in which the underlying macroeconomy will be much more risky. And that would imply a negative climate beta and, potentially substantially higher cost of carbon. I think that's, intuitive at the micro level, right? We know that climate change will make sort of extreme localized bad economic outcomes more likely, events like Hurricane Ida. But I do think there's at least some evidence that this is true for the macroeconomy and that there can be growth disasters in a hotter world, and that mitigating those could have important welfare effects. I realize that's maybe a new area, but it might be interesting for the SEC literature to think about that in the future, at least to a greater extent than my understanding is that it has to date.
Yeah, that's a great point, and it can be exacerbated by these irreversible events and so-called climate catastrophes. David Popp.
Thank you. This was a really interesting paper. A little intimidating to think about all the work that goes into calculating a number such as this. Mar's last slide I thought was really important, and I was thinking this the entire talk as well, that the social cost of carbon influences policy. And so I felt like I was watching a Star Trek episode where there's some kind of time travel going on and something's going to be violated along the way. And I'm wondering, I don't know enough about the FAIR model. Is there a way to project, given the cost of carbon that you propose, what the emissions pathway would be if the policies were followed to based on that social cost of carbon, and they limit the calculation to only ones that are internally consistent in some way. So if $56 is the cost of carbon, but Mar's point is that, well, that if we have $56, we're never going to get to the emission pathway that would actually have been assumed that makes that valuable. So is there a way to kind of connect those? I mean, that may be, there's already a lot of computing going into this that may be beyond the scope. But
okay, we have one more question. Let me call on Wendy Edelberg, and then we'll turn to the authors. I see that some of the authors have their hands up, so you'll get your turn when it's the author's time to respond.
Excellent. Thanks. So I wonder what I should make of the fact that, given the incredibly wide range of uncertainty, the potential social cost of carbon in a lot of these simulations looks like it also ventures into negative territory. And I wondered if that maybe somebody, somebody's nodding that I'm not entirely wrong on that. And so I wondered if that's just because with simulations, there's just, unless you're going to bound it at zero, that's just what's going to happen with simulations, or if that's actually a possibility, and then how adaptation plays into this. And obviously projecting adaptation out that far is, a very fraught exercise, but I wondered if that could be one of the reasons why you could see the social cost venture into negative territory.
Okay. Oh, yes. I'm sorry. One more question we'll collect, and then we'll switch. So Glenn Rudebush just raised his hand.
Yes, I just wanted to point out, basically reflecting the last two comments, There are also cases where the social cost of carbon can go infinite. And those turn out, in particular, when the real rate may go negative for a long time. That's something we've seen recently in the data. And that's something that I think the discounting module also has to grapple with. How long negative real rates may stick around, how low can that R star fall? That's something that Michael Bauer and I tried to grapple with a bit in our paper. Thanks.
Okay, so let's go back to the authors. Adrian and Roger, maybe you can start if you have some responses here.
Maybe Jim, before we do that, could
I'm sorry, excuse me. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, Adrian and Roger are indeed authors. But just
yes.
One clarification question. Do we have 1 minute to wrap this up? Or
I don't. Yeah, I think you have Let's going to take 2 or 3 minutes.
Okay.
There's not that many questions.
Yeah. Well, Adrian and Roger, were you going to respond to the questions, or did you have other things to suggest?
It was response, yeah. So should
other comment, not direct response.
Okay, yeah, I'm direct response to one to one comment too. Okay. It's actually I think it's a response to the last slide of Mar's excellent discussion and also David Pop's comment about climate feedbacks, and I just wanted to say that for population, the population work, climate feedbacks weren't explicitly included, but they were implicitly included. And I think a lot of the discussion says, well, it's very difficult to know exactly what they would be. And indeed, the biggest driver, the population model is essentially a statistical model with a little bit of expert tweaking. The biggest driver of future population is fertility, and there's essentially no evidence or knowledge that future climate, fertility have a big impact on climate, but the other way around, there's no real evidence. Mortality, it's in a sense the same thing because there's big climate impacts on mortality, but the actual number of deaths, while they lead to big damages, they're actually maybe 1/3 of 1% of total deaths. So, small changes in public health would have much bigger impacts on numbers of deaths than climate likely. And similarly, migration, what's important, migration has very little effect on total world population overall. It's international migration can have an effect when you have people from poor countries moving to rich countries. And a lot of climate disasters and so on, they tend to lead to much more internal migration than external migration. Exceptions are small island nations and probably Bangladesh. So overall, it seems like, it's very hard to nail down what these effects would be. On the other hand, we feel implicitly we've included these climate feedbacks towards population because the model was estimated based on 70 years of data from 1950 to 2020, which is a period during which there has been about 1 degree centigrade, 1 degree Celsius of warming. So basically the experience reflects, it's entirely estimated on the period during which there has been the most warming. And so we feel that implicitly the model incorporates that, and warming is likely to continue roughly at the same kind of rate. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Adrian. And maybe, do I have just 1 minute, or do we need to wrap? Yep. Maybe I'll just make 2 comments. One is, I think a number of you have brought up this concept of feedbacks, and you're exactly right that in the paper, the way that we, what we shared does not incorporate, for example, feedbacks onto economic growth from climate damages. And that particularly was by design, because you want the integrated assessment model itself to be calculating damages and then feeding that back on the pathway of economic growth, rather than having the experts or the underlying statistical model be giving you those, and then also be calculating the damages and adding them on top, because that would lead to double counting. And I feel like there was another point, but it has now eluded me, unfortunately. I would turn to my co-authors if anybody wants to speak to any of the real interest rates, or if we have time.
Kevin, the only other, am I coming through?
Yes.
Great. The only other thing I would say is that one of the other things that came up is the distinction between the marginal benefits of action and the marginal cost of taking action, and the degree to which we should be modeling them kind of matching or equating with one another. And just to be very clear, while many times integrated assessment models have been to used to determine an optimal carbon tax, meaning a tax level that where the emissions that you're seeing is consistent with the marginal damages. We explicitly do not do that on purpose. And the reason is because for benefit cost analysis and regulatory analysis, we're not informing a decision about some global optimal level of emissions or climate change. What we're informing is a regulation or a much smaller action in the scheme of global climate action. So it's appropriate to separate those things where the emissions that we're going to see in this model are being driven in a way that's not directly coupled in the model to the marginal damage estimate. So I just want to acknowledge that what was said was true, but we're deliberately not trying to achieve that in this.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm afraid we're going to need to leave it there. So let's spend whatever the minute is needed or a minute and a half that's needed to transition over to the next panel and get everybody up, and then we'll just get started right away with Ricardo Reich's paper.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.